Ja.
Towards the front. Thank you. And towards the middle also, please. Thank you.
Who's left one? Who's left of his Jesus? Both? Oh no. Huh? No, I can start. Where's it? I want to test the audio. Steak. Play the steak. help them increasing the light bulb in there.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start today's proceedings by welcoming you all on behalf of the Sydney University Muslim Students Association. I'd like to commence by giving you a brief introduction to the role that the Muslim Society plays here at Sydney Uni. The Muslim Society is present on campus to help facilitate and cater for the needs of the Muslim students. SUMSA strives to create an environment that caters for the academic, social and spiritual needs of all Muslim students on campus, as well as establishing dialogue and interfaith relations with the wider student community. SUMSA has a weekly Islamic lecture program and regularly organises barbecues, charity fundraisers, interfaith debates, sports events and the famous Islamic Awareness Week, which is currently being held. Based out of the prayer room in the Old Teachers College, a religious and social hub open to all, SUMSA hopes to reach any curious student on campus. So if you're a practicing Muslim, or just curious about Islam, or just open to a different experience, SUMSA has got something for you. During Islamic Awareness Week, we aim to host a variety of Islamic lectures and activities aimed at promoting dialogue amongst Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Please be sure to attend our remaining lectures throughout the week. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our esteemed speakers today, Hamza Tzortzis and Ian Bryce. I would like to pass you on to today's Master of Ceremonies, Hisham Crane.
In the name of God, the most gracious and most merciful, all praise and thanks belong to Him, the Creator of the universe and all that exists. May His peace and blessings be upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon him. Today, we ask a question and we discuss a topic that is very important, has been important since the beginning of humanity. The question or the topic, the proposition being put forth is that the godless are deluded. As you'll be able to extract from that, the focus of the topic today will be around the existence of God. And perhaps by extension other things which our speakers will address. Since the beginning of time, man has talked about God, man has worshipped God or gods, man has came up with arguments for or against the God, and these debates have been going on for centuries, over centuries, and they continued until the modern day. The tools we have used to conclude whether God exists or does not exist has differed over time. More recently, the use of science has been a common tool for certain people. And it is here today where we'll probably find a lot of the argument against this proposition. And also the abundance of skepticism which has crept into human thought is also a big part of whether God exists or not. And so the proposition again being put forth today is that the godless are deluded. The affirmative will be our friend and colleague and our brother Hamza Tzortzis from the UK. And just a brief background about Hamza. Hamza is an international public speaker on Islam. He's a regular speaker at universities across the UK, and he's one of the main initiators of the contemporary emergence of Muslim public speakers using Islamic and Western philosophy to shed light on Islam and demystify the Islamic way of life. He is a writer, having authored articles, essays, and commentaries on political philosophy, the philosophy of religion and society. Hamza is an intellectual activist, actively engaging on issues pertaining to religion, social cohesion, and politics. He's also a researcher with a recent publication on non-Muslim perceptions on Islam and Muslims. Hamza regularly appears in the media explaining and demystifying Islam and providing unique perspectives on current affairs. Hamza lectures all around the world on topics related to Islam, philosophy, and politics. And so, the one closest to my right, as I'm sure most of you have already concluded, is Hamza. So, we'll be hearing from Hamza very shortly. Our second speaker, our guest today, is Bryce. Bryce is a qualified in physics and engineering and has worked in industry as an aerospace engineer. He has lectured at 4 universities, creating his own courses. Ian likes teaching young people about space, science and engineering, and more recently morality. He also uses poetry to communicate science. He is chief investigator for the Australian Skeptics, where he evaluates doubtful claims using the tools of science. Ian has vigorously debated on God and religion on many forums for 30 years and was branded the Arc Secularist by the ABC. He is the Vice President of the Secular Party of Australia and has stood in 3 elections. And by default, Ian is obviously the one furthest away from me, sitting at the front there on my right. Well, before we get into the structure of today's program, we'll briefly go over a few of the rules and etiquettes for today. Please, general etiquettes whenever you're in a lecture hall, whether it be about religion or about God or about anything else. Phones off, pay attention to the speakers. Do not chat to the person next to you. If you need to leave, please leave quietly. Use one of the exits. The bathrooms are outside, so please use the bathrooms if you must. We also ask that no one call out during while each of our speakers is speaking. No one make any rude comments or anything disrespectful. There will be no warnings, rude comments, anything disrespectful, called out, the person will automatically be asked to leave. And that's to ensure that we have a healthy discussion and also one that's constructive. If we're bogged down by every person or every second person wanting to put in their 2 cents, well then really we're not going to achieve much of a debate today. So in the spirit of the debate, let us follow those rules. There will be time for question and answers at the end, so don't worry if you want to ask a question, if you feel he said something wrong or no one put him up on that point, then you have the chance to score in that regard. Just to go through the structure of today's program, the main presentations will begin straight after this with Hamza going first. He obviously represents the affirmative, and that will proceed for 20 minutes, and then the negative team will go, and that will continue for 20 minutes. Again, the affirmative will go for 10 minutes, and then the negative will go for 10 minutes. We'll then have a break for 15 minutes, 10-minute break, and then we'll continue again with our cross-examinations. Hamza will go first with his cross-examinations, and then Ian will go second. And then we'll have the conclusion, 5-minute conclusions each. Again, Hamza concluding first, and Ian concluding second. And then we'll have a 30-minute Q&A session. So this is where you get to ask questions. In the meantime, if you feel a real urge, you get an emotional sprout that you need to just shoot up and ask something, please contain yourself. I'm sure we're all able to do that. Write it down on a piece of paper, or write it on your phone. There'll be a number you can SMS your questions to if you don't want to stand up and ask those questions. So there will be 30 minutes at the end for that. Again, this is to have a constructive discussion, constructive debate, and that's what we're here for today. So I ask everyone to open their hearts and their minds to what's about to be heard. And I'd like to call up our first speaker, Brother Hamza Tzortzis.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. To proceed, brothers and sisters in Islam and brothers and sisters in humanity, I greet you with the warmest Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The Godless Delusion. I will argue today that if we use our reason, if we use our rational faculties, logic, our minds, our brains, and even our hearts, we will come to the conclusion that God is not a delusion, but rather atheism is a delusion. To argue that God is a delusion, I will use the following arguments. Only two very simple arguments. Number one, God makes sense of the origins of the universe. And number two, God makes sense of the nature of a book called the Quran. Let's go straight to the first argument. God makes sense of the origins of the universe. Now, we obviously have asked the question, why does the universe exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? Now, the grandfather for neo-atheism, Bertrand Russell, he said on a radio program, I believe in the 1960s, that the universe is a brute fact. It's just there. Didn't begin, it won't end. But the implication of this is that the universe is eternal. And if the universe is eternal, it implies it is in an actual state of physical infinity. But the question is, can we have an actual state of physical infinity? Of course we can't. And to highlight why this is the case, take the following example into consideration. Say, for instance, we have an infinite number of balls in this room, and I physically take 5 balls away. How many balls do we have left? Mathematicians will say infinity. Logicians may say infinity minus 5. But the problem is, from a practical level, taking away from the abstract notion of mathematics and applying it to the real world, it leads to problems and contradictions. This is why mathematicians Kasman and Newman, they said, the infinite certainly does not exist in the same sense that there are fish in the sea. Now there's an important note here because there is a difference between a mathematical infinity and God's infinity with the physical infinity. Take for instance, God's infinity is not referring to a collection of items with an infinite number of elements. So God's infinity can be described as qualitative. We are talking about the quantitative infinity, which is a collection of physical items to form a totality. So this leads to our deductive argument. Number one, an actual infinite in the physical world cannot exist. Number two, an eternal universe is an actual physical infinite. Number three, an eternal universe cannot exist. Number four, therefore the universe is finite. Number five, therefore it had a beginning. This is why the likes of Al-Ghazali, the 11th century theologian, Ibn Taymiyyah, the 14th century theologian, they said that the universe had a beginning. Now, since we know the universe began using deduction, which means the conclusion necessarily follows, then we could explain the beginning of the universe in the following way. Number one, it came into being and was created from or via nothing. Number two, it was created by itself. Number three, it was created by something else that was created. Or number four, it was created by something uncreated. Let's go to the first option. Could the universe come from or via nothing? Well, what do we mean by nothing? We don't mean the Professor Krauss nothing, which is something, by the way. If you read his book, he says universe is something physical, okay? Which is a bit crazy. We have to call the police because I think he's murdered the English language. Because it's like me saying, for example, yesterday I had a great dinner and it was nothing. So what we mean by nothing is basically non-being, or the absence of something, in this case, the universe itself. So based on our own definition, the universe couldn't come from nothing because being can't come from non-being. This is why P. James Ward, in his publication About Time, says, if there is anything we can find inconceivable, is that something could arise from nothing. Well, could the universe create itself? Well, simply put, this is impossible because it implies a contradiction, that something exists and doesn't exist at the same time. If you don't understand this notion, think about your mother. Could she give birth to herself? Messy thought, don't think too much. Let's go to the next option. Well, could the universe be created by something else that was created? Or if you want more abstract philosophical language, could the universe come into being by something that came into being? Well, this is irrational because that would imply an infinite regress of causes. Now take the following example into consideration. If universe 1 got its causal power from universe 2, and universe 2 got its causal power from universe 3, and universe 3 got its causal power from universe 4, and that went on forever, would we ever have universe 1? Of course we wouldn't. It would be an absurdity. That's why the Islamic philosopher and thinker Dr. Jafar Idris, he summarizes this point, and he says there will be no series of actual causes. So the best explanation, brothers and sisters or friends, is that the universe was created by something uncreated. It's the most rational explanation, using empiricism, using logic, using all types of knowledge. And this is why the philosopher Abraham Varghese, he explains this quite well. And he shows the connection between the Muslim and the atheist, believe it or not. He says, now, clearly, theists and atheists can agree on one thing. If anything at all exists, there must be something preceding it that always existed. How did this eternally existing reality come to be? The answer is it never came to be. It always existed. Take your pick. God or the universe. Something always existed. And since the universe began, therefore, this uncreated reality is the divine reality. Let's keep on thinking about this, because when we use conceptual analysis, which means use your brain, we can conclude that this uncreated creator is, number one, eternal, because he is uncreated. Number two, he's transcendent, because he created the universe. For instance, if I were to create this table, I don't become the table. I am distinct and disjoint from the table. Number three, it must have a will, because if it's eternal, and it brought into existence the universe that began, it must have chose the universe to come into existence. And choice indicates a will. It must be powerful. Split one atom and you have a lot of energy. So the one that created this reality with all these atoms must be powerful. It must be knowing. Must have knowledge, because it created laws in the universe, like the law of gravity. The lawgiver implies knowledge. It also must be one, because if it has a will, then if we use the argument of exclusion, then we can say it must be one will, therefore one God. And this is summarized by the late scholar Ibn al-Hanafi. He says, if there were two creators and they disagreed about something, such as one wanted or willed to move X, whereas the other did not want it moved, then, logically speaking, there are only three possibilities. First, the wills of two of them are both carried out. Second, only the will of one of them is carried out. And third, the will of neither of them is carried out. And we know that the first is impossible, the third is impossible, therefore there must be only one will. And we could discuss this later. So what we concluded is what Islam concluded 1400 years ago, in a very profound way, in the 112th chapter in the Quran, the book that Muslims believe came down for humanity. In the 112th chapter it says, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. Say, He is God, the unique, the uniquely one. God, the eternal, the absolute, He begets not, nor is He begotten, there is nothing like unto Him. And we're going to address contentions to this argument later. So let's go to the second argument today, which is God makes sense of the nature of the Quran. Now the Quran has been described by Eastern and Western academics as a very intrusive text. It wants to impose itself on everyone. Don't worry, my secular friends, this imposition is very positive, because it was to positively and warmly intrude and impose in a compassionate way with your heart and your mind. And the way it does this is by asking profound questions. وَفِي أَنفُسِكُمْ أَفَلَا تُبْصِرُونَ. And in themselves, do they not see? وَكَذَلِكَ نُفَصِّلُ الْآيَاتِ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. And thus to explain our signs and evidences for those who reflect. يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, coming from the triliteral stem, فَكَرَى, which means in the Arabic tradition that the thing that you're reflecting upon, think deeply, look beyond, scratch the surface. Don't be a secularist, an atheist, or a humanist. Don't be blinded by the shallowness of the kind of direct empirical reality. Go beyond. Think that step further. Interestingly, it also addresses all types of knowledge. Not only religious knowledge, not only logical truths and innate truths, but also empirical realities. The Quran, read the Quran, it mentions knowledge over 100 times, and in the context of the Quran, it refers to empirical realities. For instance, it says, have you not seen the created thing like the camel and how we created it? It talks about, go to the horizons, look into the horizons and in yourselves, and you will know that this is the truth. It also says, look how the universe was created and established. There are so many empirical realities. So if someone says to you today, or tomorrow, or the next day, that Quranic knowledge is only limited, that's wrong. It's a shallow reading of the Quranic discourse. However, the Quran goes further than this. The Quran actually challenges mankind concerning its authorship. The Quran in the 2nd chapter, verse 23 says, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ مِمَّا نَزَلْنَا عَلَىٰ عَبْدِنَا فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِثْلِهِ وَادْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. And if you are in doubt, oh my fellow secularist, humanist, skeptic, so-called thinker, if you are in doubt, then bring one chapter like it concerning this book we have revealed to Muhammad upon him peace, and challenge it, and bring your philosophers, your thinkers, your Dawkins, your Hitchens, your Harrises, your Dennetts, your Krauses, and any other pseudo-intellectual. Bring them, as the Arabs say, adayallah. Bring them and try and challenge the Quranic discourse. And you know the Quranic discourse here is referring to an array of miracles in the Quran. One of these includes the linguistic inimitability, the linguistic miracle of the Quranic discourse. And what we mean by miracle is not the David Hume miracle, it's just a violation of natural law. That's very incoherent. What we mean by miracle is the inability to establish a natural causal link between the event and the nature of the event. So how is the Quran a linguistic miracle? Well, the Quran descopes the Arabic language concerning its structural features. It's not what you would call saj'a, rhyme prose, mursal, straightforward speech, maqama, a combination of prose and poetry. It doesn't adhere to any of the rhythmical patterns of classical poetry. It descopes the Arabic language from a structural perspective. It's not based on aesthetic reception like Shakespeare. It's based on the structural features. And interestingly, when we exhaust the 20 letters of the Arabic language and the finer grammatical rules, we exhaust them, we go to the nature of the event, we can't produce the Quranic discourse. But it's supposed to come from Arabic. So we go back to Arabic and we exhaust all the finite combinations. And yet, we are dumbfounded. We can't produce the Quranic discourse. It is no wonder the famous Arabist from the University of Oxford, Hamza, he was open about this, very frank. He says, the Meccans, the people at the time of Revelation, still demanded of him a miracle, and with remarkable boldness and self-confidence, Muhammad, as a supreme confirmation of his mission to the Quran itself. Like all Arabs, they were connoisseurs of language and rhetoric. Well then, if the Quran were his own composition, other men can rival it. Let them produce 10 verses like it. If they could not, and it is obvious that they could not, let them accept the Quran as an outstanding evidential miracle. So we have another deductive argument concerning the Quranic discourse. Number one, a miracle is an event that has no natural causal link with the nature of the event. Number two, the Quran's literary form has no natural causal link with the Arabic language. Number three, therefore the Quran is a miracle. Number four, since the Quran is a miracle, it makes sense of God's existence. As Professor Bruce Rowan said from Duke University in his book, The Quran, biography on page number 8, he says, as tangible signs, Quranic verses are expressive of an inexhaustible truth. They signify meaning, layered meaning, light upon light, miracle after miracle. Now let's address some contentions here. Someone may say, hey, Shakespeare is unique. According to some Muslims, it would be Chef Zabur. But Shakespeare is not unique. If you study Shakespeare, we actually go beyond the Googleisms, we'll be able to understand that Shakespeare had something called the iambic pentameter, the blank verse, the trocade verse, that was used by Christopher Marlowe and John Fletcher and many others. You may think, well, I'm not an Arab. How can I know this? You don't have to be an Arab. You can use rational deduction. Accept a universally accepted statement, which is, no one has been able to produce or imitate the Quranic form. Well, therefore, we have some possibilities. It could have come from an Arab. But we know it could have come from an Arab because the Arabs tried and failed and they exhausted all possibilities. Could it come from a non-Arab? Well, that's impossible because you use no Arabic. Well, really came from Muhammad upon whom be peace. He was a genius par excellence. Well, I think we have an undercutting defeater for that contention. Because any human expression, if we have the blueprint today, we can emulate it. Take post-impressionism in art, Monet, Picasso, and others. If you have the canvas, the texture, the brushstrokes, the style, the colors, you can emulate it. That's why we have very expensive imitations. So therefore, we can conclude it is from the divine reality. Other people may claim, well, this argument is very subjective, it's based on language, it's subjective, it's based on how you feel. You know, just like Shakespeare, oh Romeo, Romeo, where art thou, Romeo? An Islamic version would be, oh Abdullah, where art thou? Deny thy tribe, deny thy culture. The sister do laugh the most at that. So the point is, it's not about aesthetic perception. If you were attentive, it's about a direct observable feature called the literary form. Does it have a syllabic rhythmical pattern, an accent-based rhythmical pattern? Does it end with a rhyme? Does it have an amount of rhetorical devices that we can count? It's observable. So from this perspective, we have two good arguments that God is not a delusion. The miraculous nature of the Quranic discourse and the origins of the universe. Now, there's other aspects to the Quranic discourse that make it miraculous too. For example, we have something called numerical consonance, numerical coherence. The Quranic discourse was revealed over a 23-year period, brothers and sisters and friends, for specific times and places. Yet it has this amazing kind of mathematical and literary structure. Let me give you some examples. In the 3rd chapter, God says, the likeness of Jesus is the likeness of Adam. They both didn't have a father. And funny enough, or interestingly enough, they're both mentioned 25 times each. And up to this verse, they're mentioned 7 times each. Interestingly, you have the largest chapter in the Quran, Surah Baqarah, 2nd chapter, revealed over 9-year periods for specific times and places. 286 verse. Let's do a karate chop in the middle. Hayah! And you have the 143rd verse, and you find the word middle. Interestingly, from a structural perspective, the shortest chapter in the Quran, Surah Al-Kawthar, has 10 words, has the use of 10 letters in each verse, and uses 10 letters only once throughout the whole chapter. And this was revealed over a 23-year period for specific times and places, people. It can only mean that the author knew the future. Finally, in my 1.5 minutes, I'd like to add, atheism is not an intellectual exercise. By Allah, by God, I really believe it's a psychological disposition. I do believe that. I don't mean that in an offensive way. I mean that in a psychodynamic way. So, I would think that in order for us to engage with this topic properly, intellectualism won't work. I think atheists just need a little bit of Muslim love.
And we won't waste any time, we'll go straight to Ian. So Ian will be up next for the lead.
My case on the topic of the Godless Delusion is, of course, the negative. As you can see there, can you hear me all right? Yeah. Speak up. Okay, I can't speak much louder than that. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Yep.
Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Yep.
Okay. Now, if any of you would like to make further contact after the event, perhaps to discuss the views in a bit more detail, you're welcome to approach either the Secular Party or Sydney Atheists. The websites are given there. Or alternatively, you can approach the Humanist Society, which there are quite a few members here. And there's quite a few free-thought organisations in Sydney that would be happy to discuss it. Now, I will show that the delusion lies with religion, and Islam in particular. There's 2 parts. I'm going to talk firstly about what science tells us about Islam, and that's going to show us that Islam and all religions are false. And the second part will be what morality tells us, and that'll be that Islam leads to the worst violations of human rights. Firstly, what science tells us. Hamza has already given us a bit of an indication on his version of science and what he thinks that tells us about the Quran. But instead, I'm going to lead you through a little story about science. And you can see here, this is a little diagram about perhaps where science comes from. Firstly, we have an early scientist called Aristarchus who came up with the idea that the Earth goes around the Sun and the Moon goes around the Earth. Then this one's Galileo, who was the first to use a telescope to look at the stars, followed by Kepler, who was the first to describe the planetary motions. Does any of you know who this one might be in this diagram? You would like to hazard a guess? Yes. Isaac Newton. He's observing an apple, and that's reminding him that gravity pulls apples towards the Earth and also pulls planets towards suns. And this one, of course, is Albert Einstein, the founder of relativity and that famous equation. And I think most of you would know Stephen Hawking. So there's a string of scientists spanning more than 2,000 years, each building on the ideas of the previous one. And this shows that science uses many researchers in many countries around the world over hundreds or thousands of years and with constant checks and balances. Let's look at religion instead. Here's a picture of how Islam originated. And you can see that there's in the middle we have the Prophet Muhammad. I dare not even show his image because people have been murdered for doing that. And he claims that God came to him via the Archangel Gabriel in a cave one night and revealed everything to him. As a result of that, he dictated to other people the details, the surahs of the Quran, and later on his other writings were put into other reports called hadiths, and hence rose the origin of Islam. Now, can you spot the weak point compared to science? It all hinges on one person. Not 100 scientists over 1,000 years that one person's experiences in one night. And frankly, that doesn't stack up in the slightest. Now, Hamza has justified Islam in the following terms, roughly, that it's a literacy and linguistic miracle, the Quran, and therefore it must be divinely made. Well, that doesn't follow at all. Let's look at some particular examples, some quotes from the Quran. Allah will burn you forever in fire. Unbelievers will be tormented forever. When the skin is burned off, a fresh skin will be provided, so it can be burned off again. Allah will make disbelievers' lives miserable in this world and torture them forever after they die. Cut off the hands of thieves. It is an exemplary punishment from Allah. Now, does that strike you as a linguistic and literary miracle? It sounds like the worst abomination of human rights abuses that you could conceive of. Now we're going to look at some scientific evidence. Now, all religions claim that there is a God that's intervening in worldly affairs. That diagram shows the Christian view of how God is doing it. Science says, however, that there are four forces, and they ultimately account for all that happens in the universe since the Big Bang. These are definite findings of science, well backed up again and again. And the point here is that there's no room for a God to intervene. Physics and religion are completely incompatible because there's nothing we've observed in the universe that has happened that cannot be accounted for by these four forces. There is no room for a God to intervene. So religion and science cannot both be true. If we look at medicine, Muhammad narrated, suddenly someone came to me and cut my body open from my throat to my pubic area and took my heart out and filled it with belief and returned it to its original place, and so forth. Science says the heart is for pumping blood, not holding beliefs. Thinking occurs in the brain, not the heart, and surgery requires many procedures and precautions which were not known in the 7th century. So, if you want to come to university and study medicine, how are you going to get from one to the other? You'll have to have two compartments in your brain. Islam and science are completely incompatible. Reproduction, not just Islam, but other religions too. Christianity says a woman was made pregnant by a ghost. Science says human reproduction is commenced by the fertilizing of an egg by a sperm, and 2 sources of DNA are required. How can you study medicine at university if you believe that? Life and death. Christianity says a man died and 3 days later he rose from the dead. Science says the rate of decay within the human body after death is normally split into 2 distinct categories: autolysis and putrefaction, and so forth. So therefore, if you believe in the Quran, you cannot study forensics. You're banned from that as well. Afterlives. Science says the mind is a function of the brain. It is entirely dependent on physical support systems. When the body dies, the mind stops. The diagram shows a brain there and some vital signs of the body coming to a sudden stop. Christianity says that unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life being maimed rather than having 2 hands go to hell, that the fire shall never be quenched. in Hindu says the soul similarly passes into another body at death. A sober person is not bewildered by such a change. Well, I am bewildered by such a change, and I believe that I am sober. Islam says those who believe in Allah do righteous good deeds, and they are dwellers of paradise, and they will dwell therein forever. And it goes on to give many references to paradise. There for them are pure companions, meaning virgins, there forever they abide. A sensual paradise where believing men are rewarded by being wed to 72 virgins, huris, with full-grown, swelling or pear-shaped breasts. The point here is that all religions contain some sort of afterlife. And given real knowledge that you would learn at a university, that's total nonsense from start to finish. Paleontology, the origins of humankind. Islam says your Lord created man out of a mere clot of congealed blood. Christianity says the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils, and the man became a living creature. Science says the human species evolved from more primitive creatures, and there's no supernatural involvement. You cannot hold both those ideas in the one brain unless you divide that brain into compartments in some way. Astronomy, again, the same things. Christianity and Islam say that the sun goes around the earth. Science says that the earth goes around the sun. Even Aristotle knew that 2,000 years ago. So you can't study astronomy if you believe ancient superstitions. Can I ask a quick question? How many of you are students at a university in Australia? Would you like to indicate? Well, I'd like to find out later how you manage, or whether you do manage to get these two ideas into your head at the same time, science and Islam. Now I'm going to move a bit to engineering, flight in a bit more detail. Now I used to teach aerospace engineering. I created my own courses. I've taught at 4 universities, and I've had hundreds of students from all backgrounds. And I love teaching students and interacting with them. This is the slide from one of the courses I developed called Design of Space Vehicles, which I've given about 20 times. There's some of the topics, and there's a space vehicle taking off. It covers things like astrodynamics, the space environment, rocket propulsion, the launch process, launch vehicle systems and design, spacecraft and their subsystems, space missions and payloads. So that covers a very wide variety of science. What does Christianity say about flight? As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as of gleaming metal. When they arose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them. I heard the sound of wings, like the sound of many waters. When they stood still, they let down their wings. That's the famous passage from Ezekiel, which is attributed to UFOs. And there's an artist's rendition at the time showing someone watching the wheels, which is presumably the space vehicle, and the many-headed monster, which is presumably the alien that got out of the space vehicle. Now that is utter nonsense. It's an ancient superstition. Perhaps saying it's nonsense is too much. It simply reflects the knowledge around it at the time it was made. Now we look at Islam. Gabriel did take his servant for a journey by night from the sacred mosque to the farthest mosque, famous night journey in the Quran. A white animal which was smaller than a mule but bigger than a donkey was brought to me, called a burak. The Prophet said, the animal's step was so wide that it reached the farthest point within the reach of the animal's sight. In other words, it could step several kilometres, perhaps as far as the horizon. I was carried on, and Gabriel set out with me, Gabriel the archangel. So Muhammad was carried across his dominions by this flying creature, which had a step several kilometres long or flew in the air. It's not quite clear. Utter nonsense in the light of present knowledge. This is completely incompatible with what you would learn at university. This is what I talked about flight, what science teaches. Aeroplanes are held up by aerodynamic lift derived from wings moving through the air. and rockets are propelled by expelling a jet of gas from their engines. Now this much is known in this century. It was not known thousands of years ago, which of course explains why the religions come up with different explanations. So that's a real explanation of how the world works. And what we see in all of the holy books is simply not true. It's ancient superstitions. And if you believe what it says in the holy books, you will be severely handicapped at university. So there's a total conflict between religion, particularly Islam, and scientific knowledge. This applies to all fields of science, history, geography, and so forth. If you attempt to study at university while convinced that the Quran is true, you'll be very confused and handicapped. Now, psychologists have a term for this called cognitive dissonance. Another term is the compartmentalised brain. The part of the brain might be believing what you were taught as a child about from some holy book, and the rest of your brain is trying to assimilate an entirely incompatible view of the world, perhaps from school or university. So, if you listen to the fundamentalist preachers, such as Hamza, you will be locked into beliefs from the Iron Age. You might as well return to live in a cave. And you will re-enter the Dark Ages. This is what the fundamentalists have in store for you. Now I'm going to look briefly about the historical record. We mentioned, so far we've covered a fair bit of science, some areas that I'm familiar with, and how that is totally incompatible with Islam. The historical record, I see that Hamza likes a bit of humour, so that's great, that's something we can all share. So here's, if we ask the question, why should any one God be more real than any other, then this is a view about how all religions started. Okay, here's how it works. First, you never question anything I tell you. That's the first thing, because if you start questioning what the religion says, you'll quickly reject it. Now here's a chart on Christianity, which is supposed to be a monotheism, and yet they have a whole pantheon of gods. You can see they've got God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, in the Trinity, or the Triumvirate, or the Oneness. We've got the Virgin Mary, we've got Satan, we've got saints such as Peter and Paul and the other apostles, we've got Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. All of these beings are claimed to be supernatural by Christianity, so they're gods of this sort. Then we've got angels such as Gabriel and St. Michael, and we've got fallen angels such as Satan or Lucifer or Beelzebub. So this is the total confusion which religions would foist upon us. Now the origins of Islam, I'd like to acknowledge Steve Martin for providing this material. I've said before that all religions were started by individuals or groups of individuals. The historical record is very clear. Why would they do that? What would Muhammad have to gain from it? A united people, unquestioned authority and power, laws and rules empowered and accredited his laws and rules to God, thus making them unquestionable. An invisible police force, very effective. Discipline and control over his people. Avert the blame for military loss, and enrich his family and the Levite tribe. So certainly Muhammad had everything to gain through creating Islam, which he did. It greatly enabled him to conquer many lands. About not questioning it, every religion says you must not question the beliefs. So the Bible, we see a number of quotes there from the Bible which says that you must not question it. And from the Quran, there are many times where it says you must not question it. So many quotations from the Bible there, and from the Quran here. It says, he, God, cannot be questioned concerning what he does, and they, everyone else, shall be questioned. O ye who believe, do not put questions about things which if declared to you may trouble you. Because if you start putting questions, the answers, you won't get the same answers as given in the Quran. Do not give to each other counsel of sin and revolt and disobedience to the apostle. They're not allowed. Every religion says you can't question them, which explains why they last so long in history. Now, what was Muhammad? He was a warlord above all. His job was to conquer other tribes around him and extend his powers and dominion. What would make soldiers fight harder? The promise of paradise. So he invented an afterlife, as did most religions. We saw in the scientific slides that nearly all religions have an afterlife, which is a way to make people sacrifice themselves in this life. Whosoever shall lose his life for my sake, the same shall save it. So if you lose your life fighting for Muhammad, you'll live on in an afterlife. Fear not them which kill the body, find paradise. Do not speak of those who are slain in Allah's way as dead. Nay, they are alive, but you do not perceive. So it's still alive, but you do not perceive it. Frankly, it's nonsense, isn't it? And we talked, 2 minutes, thank you. The 72 virgins is one aspect we've covered. And the Bombay bombers, the Islamic bombers there, the suicide bombers, were on their phones being promised virgins in paradise to make them carry out their bombings, which they had doubts about. And in the Quran, paradise is mentioned 531 times. And if you didn't fight sufficiently well, you went to hell. And hell is mentioned 715 times in the Quran. Jesus gave instructions to kill non-believers. For example, think not that I come to send peace on earth. I come not to send peace, but a sword. And Muhammad said the same thing. The punishment of those who wage war against Allah is only this, that they should be murdered or crucified, or their hands or feet should be cut off on opposite sides. At least they'd be balanced, I suppose, if they've lost the left hand and the right foot. So there's some examples. Another saying from the Quran, surely as for those who believe and disbelieve, again believe and again disbelieve, then increase in disbelief, Allah will not forgive them nor guide them in the right path. Which reminds me of Colin Powell, who said there are knowns. There are things that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know we don't know. Well, I can't understand any of those. I'm very confused. So I'm going to stop there and to conclude. In the next section I'll look at what morality tells us. I think so far we've shown that Islam and science, meaning the broad view of science, meaning history and geography, are completely incompatible. And if you wish to study at university, you'll have to put your Islam beliefs into its own compartment or abandon them altogether. Thank you.
A bit of silence, please. Sorry, my voice is a bit loud. We're just going to call up Hamza now. It's 10-minute presentations each. So first, again, with the affirmative, Hamza, and then Ian will give his next 10-minute presentation following that. Thank you.
Okay, there's a lot to go through. Firstly, I think I know where our beloved interlocutor studied. I think he went to the University of Google and to the College of YouTube. I'm going to address this poor man's soul in the appropriate way, which is hopefully with a bit of morality. But let me go through all of his points. I've written every single one down. Number one, Islam and science. Straw man, red herring, smelly fish. Basically, essentially, concerning science, let's go to the historians of science. David C. Lindbergh, he says that the scientific method was produced by whom? It was a Muslim. His name was Ibn al-Haytham, who wrote the book on optics. It was the first manifestation of a formal method of the scientific method. Professor Thomas Arnold says, if it wasn't for Islamic Spain that was influenced by Islamic culture, that was influenced by the Quran to look into the interconnecting principles of nature, we wouldn't have the Renaissance. If you never had the Renaissance, you wouldn't be living in Australia. Second point. He says the weak point is actually Muhammad upon whom be peace. The claim just went to Muhammad is very unscientific. Again, a straw man. It's a logical fallacy. He's misrepresented the argument. Essentially, what Muhammad upon whom peace brought was the Quran itself. And it gives you a challenge. There's a falsification test there. It's not as if we have to believe what he says. instead, he brought this miracle and he says, if you don't believe this is not true, then challenge it. Again, another straw man. Number 3, he read English translations of the Quranic discourse saying, that's not great literature. The Quran's in Arabic. It's an Arabic miracle. This one is the best one. It shows they have no understanding of philosophy, of logic, of reason. I mean, it looks like he came from the cave. Listen to this one. Listen to this one. Listen to this one. He said, intervening God, it's impossible. We have the 4 forces of nature. We know how things happen. Yes, I know that. But you're conflating the how with the why. You're making them say the same. We know how things happen. Yes, we believe as Muslims. It's the forces of nature. Even that classical tradition said there were some physical causes. But why is the kind of religious dimension that unfortunately science can't really entertain. So you're conflating the how with the why. Then you said the hadith on the heart. It came out, it was clean, it's irrational. This is a miracle. This is a spiritual metaphysical issue. Why are you reducing everything to your empirical paradigm? It's outside of your empirical paradigm. The next point, Islam says that, rather Christianity says something about embryology. And you see what he does? He's equivocating Christianity and Islam is 2 different things. Because Islam actually says nutfa and amsaj. What's amsaj? An intermingling of fluids. And from the male and the female. So do your reading, please. Then you talk about Christianity and miracles. Well, this is Islam. Christianity and Islam are different things, so you have to appreciate that. Then he said about the afterlife. We know now in science that the mind and brain is interconnected. The brain dies, the mind dies. I mean, this is the most shallow, unacademic, unnuanced thing I've ever read in my life concerning neuroscience. I mean, I was willing to just jump up and say, Eureka, please shut up. Because I'm not being bad. If we study a very basic 14-year-old book on consciousness, we would know there's a thing called the hard problem of consciousness, which, as Professor David Sharma says, that we don't have a physicalist, materialistic, empirical answer for this. We have to now claim other properties for the universe which are unseen, metaphysical, conscious properties. It's not just directly correlated to the material brain. Please evolve your reading from 1970s. Now, again, more Christianity examples. Wrong. Then he said man was created from congealed blood. Again, English translation, the word is alatai, but also mean something that clings. And we know, according to many modern embryologists like John Allen and Beverly Kramer, what do they describe the embryo to be? Something that clings on the connecting stalk. Let's read our medicine. Then he says the sun around the earth. Did you ever read the verse? Did it say the sun around the earth in that verse? Did it say that? He's reading into the Quran. He's a fundamentalist. So, then he gave another Christianity example. Red herring, straw man, illogical. Then he says the night journey. We know things work with rockets and energy. Well, the horse, Burak, was a metaphysical, miraculous thing. We believe in miracles. You have to disprove that miracles are incoherent philosophically for you to have a justification for your claim. We never claimed it was a physical or empirical reality. Then you said there's too many gods. Which one are we going to choose? Well, the one that we have proof for, like I gave you proof for the Quran and you haven't dismantled it. Next point, Muhammad upon whom be peace. What did he have to gain? He gained all this power. This is a quote mining, misreading, a non-reading, a borrowing from some steward, whoever his name is, and not even doing the reading yourself. Muhammad upon whom be peace for the first 13 years, tortured, abused. He was so hungry he tied 2 stones to his stomach. He was stoned by children for hours. His blood was running down his leg. The sandals were stuck to the sand. His wife passed away. His uncle passed away. His companions were tortured and abused. And he's saying for gain? Even when he gained military power, what was it for? He had no smoke coming out of his house for months or years because he couldn't afford food. He would live on dates and water. And you said he has something to gain? That's the biggest misreading. It's like saying, for example, reading Hamza, and it says, to be or not to be, whether it's noble in the mind of man to withstand the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take up arms and whatever. It's like saying Hamza was a jihadist just by reading that. And then you say, he was a war. One second, then you say he was a warlord. Yes, he did go to war for humanity, for peace and justice and mercy. That's why the Jews in history, read your history, my friend. The Jews, like Zion Zohar, the academic in Safari Jewry, he said thus, when the Muslims crossed Gibraltar and Iberian Peninsula. The Jews saw the Muslims as liberators from Christian persecution. We had Heinrich Bryce, a 19th century Jewish historian, saying what? That the Jews lived favorably under the Mohammedans. You had in 1453 a book from Constantinople, a primary source from a rabbi. He's saying to his brethren, Jews, come to the land of the Muslims, the Turks. Rich are the fruits of the earth, will not oppress with heavy taxes. The Jacobites that were pressed under the Orthodox tradition, the Byzantians, they were being tortured and killed by the old Christian people. They were calling the Muslims to come because they were their own liberators. So it was about justice and mercy who wasn't the warlord. Also, you talk about Islamic bombers. What a cheap shot. Cheap shot. Do you read it? If you can read. because, let me tell you why. And I'm not being rude because he's come up with cliches, with outdated cliches. And let me just tell you something. If you read the history in the past 2 centuries, 80 million people plus in the name of secularism, not in the name of religion. The past 2 centuries, there's been more blood in the name of non-religious ideology than any other religion. I would challenge anybody until the cows or the sheep come home. Finally, brothers and sisters of faith, this is the first time I've addressed every single point. Finally, he quotes Surah 5, 33-34, that whoever raises war against Allah and His Messenger, then you either exile them or cut the hand, the feet, etc. Do you know what this is in Islamic jurisprudence? Have you read a basic book of Islamic jurisprudence? I will guarantee you haven't. Because this verse is about hiraba, the criminal code called hiraba. Do you know what hiraba means? Terrorism. This verse is against terrorism. It's actually the punishment for terrorists. That's the irony. So, and it includes highway robbery and rape. Because if you rape a woman, you don't need 4 witnesses, by the way. DNA and her testimony is enough. You have a very severe punishment. In the secular West, you get more for stealing and less for raping. God bless you.
And again, I won't waste any time. Ian, feel free to come up and address the audience with your 10-minute presentation.
I'm still looking for one decent argument from Hamza. You see lots of shouting and yelling and ranting and raving, but no actual facts. Hamza speaks a fair bit about deductive logic, but he should know that no amount of logic can substitute for observations about the real world. In any logical system, whether it's deductive or inductive, you can use a system of reasoning to reach a conclusion, but what's missing is the starting premises. The reasoning only starts if you've got some premises at the beginning. And if you're going to reach a conclusion about the real world, you need observations about the real world. There's a saying about arguments that if there's no armadillos in the premises, there can be no armadillos in the conclusion. The faulty sort of argument is illustrated by the case where you argue that the moon is made of green cheese. You can prove anything from a false assumption. So, when Hamza argues about the universe and science, what's missing is observations about the real world. Science is based entirely on observations of the real world, not about rhetoric and argument. So that's where it falls down. But now we're going to move on to part 2, which is what morality tells us. Now there's a very long list of atrocities of every type committed by fundamentalists. I haven't got time to go through them or even start, so we're going to look at some currently in the news. For example, Bachar Posh, the dressing of girls as boys in Afghanistan, some areas of Islamic Afghanistan. If a family has only daughters, then they're in shame because they need a son So they invent a son. They get one of the girls and dress her up as a boy, to play as a boy and masquerade as a boy. But at puberty, they turn that boy back to a girl. And she then has to behave as a woman. In other words, she has to start acting very subservient, even though she's been brought up as a boy. And this demonstrates the inferiority of women in these cultures, the inequality of women. The secular party, I should have said at the beginning, stands for universal values like equality and honesty and justice and freedom. And equality means equality of all people. We don't ask the women to sit on one side of the room and the men on the other like they did tonight. The same is happening in Afghanistan when they feel the need for a boy, so they dress a girl up as a boy, because and this is based on the Quran and the teachings of 1400 years. And we believe it's a gross violation of human rights. It causes great suffering when they have to change that. Permanent psychological damage. And hasn't been redressed in 1400 years because Islam can't be questioned. Leaving of belief systems. Most religions threaten to punish anyone leaving the faith. Islam is very much the worst there. If you leave your Islam faith, you can be stoned to death according to Sharia law. And that's been handed down for 1400 years and is still the case in many countries. If you compare it to free thought systems such as those espoused by the secular party and the humanists and city atheists and so forth, then you're encouraged to think for yourself. And if you reach a conclusion that differs from everyone else, then good luck to you. It's all the better if you can defend it and discuss it. So there's a very big difference. Segregation of sexes. Security expert Professor Anthony Glees of the university in the UK, Berkshire, I think, said that students, Berkeley I should say, no, Berkshire, said students' rights research indicates that there is a failing in our higher education system. We can and should stop radicalisation on campus by extremists who believe in segregation. Otherwise, more students and graduates will eventually embrace terror. The added terrorists are not born, they are made. Well, and it's very genuine to see attempted segregation of men and women, which again reinforces the indoctrination of young people into Islamic beliefs, which defy all basic human rights of equality. The Kenya Mall atrocity, very recent. 69 dead so far. The Somali militant group, Al-Shabaab, said it carried out the attack. Witnesses said the gunman at the West Gate tried to identify Muslims by asking shoppers the name of Muhammad's mother. Those who didn't know got shot. Is that the sort of thing we want in this country? This illustrates the fact that the Quran says it is okay to kill infidels. Fundamentalist Islam has a continuous history of doing so ever since, and is still doing it today. And what I want to know is, where are the decent Muslims protesting against this? Silence is deafening. Subjugation in terrorist organisations. Muslims living among non-Muslims. That was detailed in the Quran and the Hadiths. You've got three options. Convert them to Islam, kill them, or conquer them and submit them to dimitude, which is a form of slavery. Now, dimitude involves subjugation. Take total control of them. It has elements of slavery. Rape is permitted if there is any revolt, and they have no say in government. And it is compulsory. It's detailed in the Quran, has been practiced throughout history by Islamic extremists, by the hardline Islamists. It's espoused by modern Islamist groups. And what they want to do is install a caliphate, which includes Sharia law, and then the non-Muslims become dhimmis. And there's a new generation of extremists preaching at British universities. It's clear that they're trying to, the ultimate aim is to install dimitude. We've met Professor Anthony Glees before, and is failing in the higher education system. We had that quote before. Now there's another group called Hizb ut-Tahrir. This was formed in 1953, and is a group seeking to impose Islamic states or caliphates ruled by Islamic law, with a caliph as the head state elected only by Muslims. Treatment of apostates The draft constitution declares that Muslims who have by themselves renounced Islam are guilty of apostasy and are to be executed. This is from their draft constitution. Treatment of infidels, including Australians, non-Muslims in a Muslim country become dhimmis, subjugated, dominated and denied any role in government. Couldn't happen in Australia, could it? Here's what I read in Australia. You visit their website. It says Muslims rise, caliphate imminent. So their aim is to overthrow the government of Australia and the Islamic government. And the spokesman was in Duri. I don't know whether he's here tonight. But I would like to ask Hamza whether he has been in touch with this group since he's been in Australia. Now, freedom of speech. What do you think about freedom of speech? This is something that Hamza Tzortzis said in 2008. We as Muslims reject the idea of freedom of speech, even the idea of freedom. So Hamza, does this mean that you want to, did you have your way to muzzle me and murder me? Lock me up?
You're a liar.
This is from your website.
No, it's not. Why would I put that on my own website? Just like your colleague, who said there's no knowledge in Islam when it's mentioned 100 times in the Quran. This is lies, this is deceitful, and I'm glad you're not a politician. And I'm glad you're irrelevant in this society concerning politics. This is immoral. Yeah. It's not on my website. It's an accusation about me. There's a difference. Can we read?
So in conclusion, I'd like to say that fundamentalist Islam is completely incompatible with science and other knowledge. The historical record shows that Islam and most religions were invented by individuals or groups to extend their power, wealth and influence. Religions, particularly Islam, have the worst human rights record. This cannot change as long as we are not allowed to question Islam. Islamist organisations dedicated to establishing caliphates and dhimitude, which is a form of slavery, around the world. And many Islamists in Australia and universities and here tonight have such designs on Australia. Thank you.
Just before we go to break, I'd like to remind everyone of a rule we established at the beginning. We are being lenient to begin with, but after the break that won't be the case. Everyone had a choice in being here. You chose to come, you chose to listen. If you're not willing to participate within the rules set out, then please feel free to leave during the break, because it won't be tolerated after the break. If the speaker asks another speaker a question and he responds, that's completely fine. But at no stage is anyone from the audience to comment or respond in any way. Whether you're with the for or the against, it won't be tolerated. You'll be treated equally, and you'll be taken out equally in the same way. So we're going to go for a 10-minute break now. When we come back, we hope that people can abide by the rules a bit better. Thank you.